Hi students, welcome to your notes presentation on miners, ranchers, and railroads. You have a couple options of how you can do this. One, you could make this presentation full screen and then pause the video whenever you need to go fill out your notes outline. Or your other option is split the screen. So drag one tab to one side and then have your notes open over on the other side and fill it out at the same time. Either way works. But let's go ahead and get started right away. Make sure that you are following along and listening because everything I'm talking about is important, and I'm going to be talking about things that aren't necessarily in the notes, but it's really going to help you understand the whole story. So sit back, relax, and get ready to do some notes on miners, ranchers, and railroads. So when we last left off, the Civil War had just happened and ended. We know that the Union won. That's why the United States exists today, and there's no country called the Confederate States of America. And we talked about Reconstruction, the rebuilding of our country. Kind of going on at the same time. Some of the events we're going to talk about today actually happened during the Civil War, but it doesn't really go with that whole theme. So that's we kind of talk about it afterwards. But a lot about what we're talking about today is happening in the Great Plains. So if you look at this map, that's kind of the middle of America. Some states that, not a lot of people, well, some people like to come visit these states, but it's a really unique place. And we're going to be talking about mining in this area. We're going to talk about railroads, about cattle farming, and wars with Native Americans. And then we'll end with talking about people moving west and why they're moving west. So starting with the mining boom, the West was kind of seen as the last frontier. It was an undeveloped area. After California was admitted to the Union in 1850, people are going to want to move west. They're going to move west to build homes. They're going to fence off their land, and railroads are going to bring a lot of industry to the West. One big thing that's going to make people move west is in 1859, Henry Comstock discovered a huge deposit of gold and silver in Nevada and called it the Comstock Lode. And this is, people are going to hear about it, and kind of like the gold rush in 1849, remember 49ers, California, kind of like that, people from all over the world are going to come to this area to want to strike it rich. It's actually going to produce about $500 million worth of gold and silver just in Nevada and Arizona area. So that's a lot of that's a lot of gold to find. Mining was obviously very dangerous because there could be lung disease, fires, cave-ins. It was actually considered one of the most dangerous jobs in the U.S. And but it didn't matter. People were willing to take that risk to strike it rich. And mining is going to produce these things called boom towns. They're communities that grow suddenly where a mine is opened. Usually they have a general store, a saloon, and a boarding house. Very few women or families live in these towns. You've probably seen them. Oh, I'll talk about this first. Here's a picture showing Comstock Lode. So if you look up at the top, this would have been where people's houses were, and this is showing underground how intricate the mine was underground to find this gold and silver. So, and then over here it looks like this was like an elevator you could even take down. So, kind of cool picture. But back to talking about the boom towns, you've probably seen these if you've ever watched a movie like a Western, and you see these cute little towns that started as gold rush towns, not just in California, but in other places as well. One famous one was Deadwood, South Dakota. You can kind of see, I said, they have some important stores that gold rush people might need. You got your wagons and horses. You even have people moving logs and things like that. But these little towns would, start up, and they're called boom towns. They're small little towns. This one is not in your notes, but I just thought it was a cool thing to sort of add in here. You have this idea of what you hear about with the Wild Wild West, and maybe you think of Will Smith. I don't know what you think of, but there's a lot of myth and reality that goes on with the Wild Wild West. So myth, the cowboy was a free spirit, going off and riding free on the open plains. In reality, most cowboys were actually employees. They worked for somebody. They joined labor unions. They even went on strike. So they weren't just this free spirit. That's a total myth. Another myth, Western cow towns were wild places with gunfights, pew pew, and little law and order. There's chaos and fighting. Reality, most were actually very orderly with active law enforcement, and showdowns rarely occurred. I know, I like to think in my mind that it was the wild, wild west, but it was maybe just one wild and not two wilds, get it? Okay, last myth. Cowboys were mostly Anglo-Americans, Anglo referring to like Anglo-Saxon, so white Americans. Reality, actually, 25% of cowboys were African-Americans, 12% were Latinos. So very, not just all white people. Cowboys were a little more diverse than what we might think. So moving on to talk about cattle kingdom. So the cattle industry is going to boom because there's going to be a greater demand for beef in the eastern states, where in the Midwest you could buy a cow for $3 to $6. In Texas, like a place like that, if you were to sell that meat in New York, it'd be worth $80. So $3 in Texas, $80 in New York. So it just showed that there was a high demand for cattle. And the Longhorn were the most typical cattle. I think I have a picture of them on one of the next slides. They were the most popular because they required very little water. They could survive harsh weather, and they were good to herd. But how do you get this cattle, this meat, from the middle of America over to New York? We need a railroad. So, and by the way, when we talk about this cattle kingdom, it's the land that goes from Texas to Canada, where many ranchers raised their cattle. The workers who took care of the cattle were called cowboys or cowhands. They actually borrowed a lot of their techniques from the vaqueros. So they borrowed things like the Western saddle, roping techniques using the lasso, even the broad hats. These were all from vaqueros, which, were like a Mexican cowboy. So those were all borrowed from them. You can kind of see this guy. He's sporting some of those traditional cowboy outfits. So here, you can see some longhorn cattle here. Check out their horns. So the job of a cowboy was to make a long journey called a cattle drive, and he would herd the cattle to market or to the northern plains for grazing. So sometimes they would move them north to bring them close to trains, to put them on trains and load them up, bring them to the east, and then, wow, you've got your cheeseburger. Or some of them, they would move north for grazing so they can fatten them up and things like that. But they covered hundreds of miles of land, so they had to be very organized and know how to herd those cattle. It definitely took skill. The most popular way that cowboys went was the Chisolm Trail that ran from San Antonio, Texas to Abilene, Kansas. It was one of the most earliest and popular routes. And as competition begins between farmers and large ranchers and small ranchers, it's going to lead to fights over land in the middle of America. And when barbed wire is invented in 1874, it makes it way easier to rope off land and really cheap to do that. And then also a lot of cattle are going to start to eat all the prairie grass. And there's some really severe winters from 1885 to 1886. So all of these things happening are going to lead to the end of cattle kingdom. Again, because people start roping off their land. It's not just this vast open plains anymore. And there you go. End of cattle kingdom and the wide open west with the cowboys and the herding the cattle. So here's some good pictures to show you the things I talked about. The Chisolm Trail, which I mentioned, is the pink one here. So you can see I said it went from San Antonio up here to Kansas. And notice it's leading to these little lines, which if we look at our key, that's showing it's a railroad. All the little orange dots are cattle ranches. And again, you see most of them are all going to be in Texas and leading up north to the railroads to bring them to the east or to the west, wherever people want to buy meat. Here's some cowboys riding, or a cowboy riding and herding cattle. And here's another picture of them as well. These are all pictures from the time period, which is kind of cool to check out. So moving on to Transcontinental Railroad. As people move west, there's going to be more demand for communication and easier way of sending goods. Actually, the Pony Express begins in 1860, which is a system of messengers on horseback. They go across the U.S. and they send messages, but that's going to kind of be eliminated with the telegraph line, so that's why I didn't even put it in the presentation. The Transcontinental Railroad, though, is important to note. It's a railroad that's going to cross the continent, connect east to west, and many people want this and demand it. So Congress is going to pass some railway acts, which is going to give huge land grants to railroads. So it's like free land for the railroads, as long as the railroads promise that they will make sure they move troops and mail at lower cost for the government. So you can have the free land, just you have to do some things for us. So the two big companies that are going to compete to build a railroad across the U.S. are the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific starts in Sacramento. Union Pacific starts in Omaha, Nebraska. Here's an actual picture from the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. I thought I'd show you this one because remember, this is not just flat lands that they're building these railroads on. They're going through mountains. And how do you build a railroad through a mountain? It's called dynamite. And dynamite also means increased death risk. That's what I'll say with that. So it was actually like a huge competition between these two railroads to see who could build the fastest and get the furthest. The people who worked on railroads were mostly immigrants, a lot of Chinese and Irish, and the Chinese were paid lower than anybody else, and they were given the most dangerous jobs out of anybody else. But why was it worth it for them? They could make 10 times the amount of money that they could make in China. So it was worth it. Challenges they faced were mountains, snow drifts, things like that. But eventually these two railroads are going to meet on May 10th, 1869 in Promontory, Utah. A gold spike is used to connect the railroad to join the two tracks together after this epic race. It was really funny because the person who did the gold stake, it was the governor. I'm pretty sure he was the governor of California, Governor Stanford. And, oh, no. He was governor, and he was also president of the Central Pacific. Okay, that was the right person. So what he did is he took his sledge out and he went to drive the gold stake into the ground, and he totally missed it. And people commented on this and wrote about it in their diaries. So this really did happen. And people started laughing about it and were yelling about it. And then he tried again, and then he got the stake in. So there's your little fun story. So the results of this Transcontinental Railroad, why it's important: it increases economic growth and population. It makes transportation way faster, and it's going to encourage people to move west. Now you don't have to go on your covered wagon. You could take a train. And the railroad, the trains are going to become one of the biggest industries in the U.S. So trains were a big investment and a good investment back then. Here's an actual photograph again from the time. This is when they drove the gold spike in, and so you see the two trains meeting and coming together. Looks like someone's got some champagne up here. This is a really epic picture. I like it, but this guy looks like a ghost who's probably moving during the picture. So, cool picture. And here's a map showing the route that they took. So remember, the first one started here in Sacramento. The other one started here in Omaha, and they built across. And remember, look here in Sacramento. They had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, but they had to cross over here the Rocky Mountains. So it wasn't an easy task at all. It was a very epic journey. So moving on to wars in the West, because obviously it's not like this land, as people are moving west, it's not just empty and open and nobody's living there. We have hundreds and thousands of Native Americans living on this land, and you're going to see a lot of conflict happening. So as they move west, they continue to pressure the government to make more land available as settlers move west. And so the government starts to negotiate with some of the Plains Indians. So remember, the Plains are just that middle part of America. So some of the Native American tribes were the Apache, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, the Pawnee Sioux. They all speak different languages, but it was actually kind of interesting. They all use a common sign language to communicate if needed, for trade and things like that. So kind of interesting. These tribes all depend on horses and buffalo. And at this time, there's hundreds and thousands of buffalo across the plains. These tribes use buffalo for food, for shelter, for clothing, utensils. They said they used all the parts of the animals. So the U.S. is going to negotiate a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and it's the first major treaty between the U.S. government and the Plains Indians, and it recognizes their claim to the land, but also says, hey, you can have some land, but the U.S. needs to build forts and railroads, and we promise we'll pay for any damage that we do to your land. So This map is showing, as defined by the Fort Laramie Treaty, like the Sioux territory and their surrounding land. So this is all land belonging to the Sioux. And yes, we can build forts here, another fort here. You can see some of the Pawnee land here as well. Um, So everything's all great except gold is discovered in Colorado. And then, of course, guess what? More people move west, clash with natives. And a lot of people are going to push in 1861. So again, think about this. This is all happening as the Civil War is happening, right? 1861 is when the Civil War happened. So 1861, people are going to say, let's just start putting Native Americans on reservations. Basically, it's like a set of land set aside just for Native Americans, but that they have to stay on the lands. That's where there's going to be a problem because the Native Americans are following buffalo because they use them for food and all those things I talked about. And buffalo don't just stay in like one area. They're going to move where they want. So it makes it impossible to hunt the buffalo. A lot of Native Americans are going to resist to being moved onto the reservation lands, and there's going to be conflict. So here's our first conflict. Our first conflict is going to happen at, there are other conflicts as well, but the main one that I'm going to talk about is the Battle of Little Bighorn. So in 1874, guess what? Again, gold is discovered. It's discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And this is a problem because there's Native Americans living in that area. The one to know, his name is Sitting Bull. He's a leader of the Lakota Sioux, and he protested soldiers coming there, protested more settlers coming there. He got other tribes to join him as well, and eventually fighting is going to break out. And so the government sends Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, along with some troops, to go in there and get the Native Americans out of the way so that these settlers can go get gold. Okay. Custer, some fun facts about him. He was actually, he went to West Point, which is that famous military academy. He graduated last in his class. So that's a interesting fun fact. And he fought in the Civil War. He fought in the Battle of Bull Run, in Gettysburg, even at Appomattox Courthouse at the end of the war, and he was there when Robert E. Lee surrendered. He rose through the ranks of the military as he was in the Civil War. He had a lot of friends and buddies who helped him out. And then, like I said, he's going to be sent in to deal with the fighting going on over this land in South Dakota. Secretary of the Interior, Columbus Delano, says, I'm inclined to think that the occupation of this region of the country is not necessary to the happiness and prosperity of the Indians. They don't need this land. As it is supposed to be rich in minerals and lumber, it is indeed important to have it freed as early as possible from Indian occupancy. So you can kind of see people's views and ideas of land ownership by Native Americans. They didn't think that they needed it, that it was more important that we get gold and things like that from it. On the other hand, you have the Native American view. So Sitting Bull, the Lakota Sioux chief, said, look at me and look at the earth. It was our fathers and should be our children's after us. If the white men take my country, where can I go? I have nowhere to go. I cannot spare it, and I love it very much. Let us alone. So a battle is going to occur between Sitting Bull as well as his buddy Crazy Horse. They're going to fight Custer and his troops. And what's crazy and interesting is Custer and his troops are completely defeated. All of them are killed. The newspapers called it Custer's Last Stand. Custer was killed as well, along with two of his brothers that were fighting also. And there's a lot of controversy around this event. This was great for the Native Americans, even though it was actually their last major win. And after this, they're just going to suffer a lot of losses. But some people painted Custer as like this hero who died. Some people, like Ulysses S. Grant, said he was an idiot because he didn't move his troops in great directions, and he's the one who caused their death. So there's very mixed reviews of him. And there's even evidence that other troops had offered to help Custer in this battle, and he rejected it and said he had no problem, oh, my troops can easily kill off these Native Americans. Even though they were greatly outnumbered, he's like, no problem, we got this. And then No, they didn't get it. So last big win for the Sioux, but this is called Battle of Little Bighorn. So as we continue to see fighting in the plains, in 1890, the U.S. Army shot and killed about 150 Sioux at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. This was the last major incident on the Great Plains, and many of these people that were killed were unarmed women and children. And this is an actual picture from the area showing some of the Native Americans that were killed in 1890. And again, this is another picture from this same attack, right? Same Battle of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Interesting picture. Other battles that go on between Native Americans and the U.S. in the 1860s, the Navajo in Arizona and New Mexico were ordered off of their land and onto a reservation. They refused. There was battles. It wasn't just like an easy, like, oh, no problem, we got this. They were actually starved out. The U.S. troops raided their land, and the Navajo ran out of food, and so eventually they were forced to surrender, and then they were forced to walk this march called the Long Walk. It was a 300-mile march, and many of them died on the march. So it sounds similar to other Native American history that we've learned about, right? Trail of Tears with the Cherokee. This is the Long Walk, and this was the walk that the Navajo were forced to walk. But by the late 1800s, many tribes in the plains had stopped fighting and were being moved onto reservations, and many of them had been defeated. So very sad part of our history. Just to know, it's going to take a long time for our government to acknowledge Native Americans and to give them back a lot of their land, to give them back any at least some of their land and acknowledge their claim to any of the lands. So moving on to the Dawes Act, in 1887, this was passed by our government, and it tried to lessen the traditional influences of Indian society by making land ownership private rather than shared. So basically what happened is the government said, okay, if you Native Americans agree to each break up the land and live on it independently, then we'll let you have it and we won't bother you and we'll give you American citizenship. But if you want to continue this communal land ownership, like how you all live together as a tribe and share the land, then we're just going to take your land and we're going to auction it off. So what they were trying to do was force assimilation. You see that word up here. Basically, they were trying to make Native Americans adopt European American culture. And it doesn't just stop with land ownership, it goes even further than that. And here's an actual poster from the time showing Indian land being auctioned off and that you could come and buy Indian land for great value. So assimilation didn't just stop with land ownership, but there's going to be schools that are going to be open to try and force Native Americans to adopt Western culture. So here's a picture showing a Native American before and after assimilation. Here's a picture of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This was a school that was opened that many Native American children were attended, and again, were taught Western values and taught that everything that they valued as Native Americans was wrong, and that their ideas of spirituality and their ideas of communal ownership and helping each other and being a tribe, that's all wrong, and that they should adopt Western ways. Again, you're seeing a Native American woman in her traditional outfit, and then as in her Western outfit. Again, a picture of, Henry Standing Bear, Wounded Yellow Robe, and Chauncey Yellow Robe. These are Sioux boys as they entered the school, and then 3 years later. And here's a map showing reservations today. I guess I should have had one that showed reservations back then and then today, but you can see where reservations exist. They're all the dark gray areas, and where they don't exist. So things have changed a lot for Native Americans, and this Dawes General Allotment Act that I was talking about, the Dawes Act, that doesn't go away until the 1940s. When FDR is president. Actually, I think it's in the 1930s. It's when he makes the New Deal. It's after the Great Depression. You won't learn about this till later, but he basically cancels that whole idea and lets Native Americans return to communal living, lets them have their own self-government and things like that. So it's going to take a long time for things to change for Native Americans. So moving on for Native Americans, we're going to talk more about farming and like the other people that were moving west and occupying this land. So in 1862, two very important land grants are passed. They're called the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. So the Homestead Act is going to be where they give government land to small farmers, and basically any adult U.S. citizen, or even if you just plan to become a citizen, you could apply for this and you could get 160 acres of land for free. You just must promise to live on the land for 5 years. Great deal. Free land. Can you believe that? Can you imagine if they did that today? And then there's the Morrill Act, which grants 17 million acres of federal land to the states, and just says each state has to sell the land to like people, probably for a good deal, and use the money to build colleges and teach agriculture and engineering, help out these farmers that are coming west. So a lot of people are going to take advantage of this. A lot of people from the East Coast are going to leave because it's getting crowded, and they're going to want to come west. So here's a picture of an East Coast family leaving for the land rush. So what I mean by land rush is, I think that might be on one of the next slides, but they would basically have these big events where people would come and line up on like a starting line, and then they would just say go, and people would like take their carriages or horses and they would try and go and find like a stake that had like a little flag on it, and if they took that and put their stake there, that means that was their land to have. So people would come all over. Here's another picture of people coming from all over to come to this land rush and get land, and I have a clip of it actually that you guys can watch as well. So this is the first Oklahoma land rush. It happened in April 22nd, 1889. And like I said, people literally like stood at a starting line, and then they're going to go rush and try and claim their land. Seems really interesting. So who are the people that are coming for this land? Like I said, a lot of families are coming from crowded East Coast that are tired of the crowded conditions. Single women. The government actually let unmarried women, which was very unusual, come and get land. So you could be unmarried, you could be a widow, and you could come get free lands. That was cool. And then you're also going to see a lot of African Americans come from the South. They're called exodusters because they made a mass exodus or departure from the South. Oh, and here's a little clip. I'm going to say that I'll add this clip into your notes, and maybe you should just click on it and watch it, because I'm worried if I click it that it's not going to work. So this clip will be in your notes for you to watch. Here's a picture of some exodusters, some African Americans moving west to farm. So farming isn't easy work, though. It's very extreme weather on the plains, and the soil was very difficult. So you had to break up the sod, and it was very difficult because the ground was really tough. So these people became known as sod busters, like that was their nickname. And a lot of farmers are going to adopt this method called dry farming, where it shifts away from like water-dependent crops like corn, and instead farmers are going to grow things like wheat that didn't require as much water, and it's going to become very common across the Midwest. So the plains are going to become known as the breadbasket of the world because they're going to ship food around the world. And women are going to have a big role out west. They work on farms, they have strong voice in public affairs, and this is why Wyoming is going to become the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1869, which is kind of cool because women aren't going to get the right to vote like federally by like our government until 1920. Wow, so 50 years before the government passes it, the state of Wyoming gave women the right to vote. Pretty cool. So here's a picture of some plains farmers. I like the cow that's up here on the mountain. They kind of built their house into a hill, which is a smart idea because it's going to protect it from wind. But check out these people. Oh, there's even a little dog as well. How cute. Oh, it looks like they're cutting watermelon or something. That's fun. I just noticed too, even the horses have to like pose for the picture. That's funny. Okay, here's some more pictures of farmers. Here's some farmers with wheat. Remember what I talked about? And here's some farmers farming that wheat as well. So some other fun things to point out is as people are moving west and farming is increasing, from the years 1860 to 1890, so that's 30 years, over 30 years, the U.S. population more than doubled. That's crazy. And with that, farms are going to triple. So with that is going to lead to overproduction. So like overproduction of goods, and farmers are going to start to lose their land because they overproduce too much food that they couldn't even sell. It's going to lead to deflation, which is basically like low money supplies and even lower prices. So low prices are good for the consumers, but they're not good for the people that are like creating the goods. So in 1866, this guy named Oliver Hudson Kelley saw how the farmers were suffering because of this deflation, and he formed something called the National Grange. It's like a social and educational organization for farmers. They fundraised like bills, they supported political candidates, all to try and get things to support farmers. That was the whole point of the National Grange. And also, farmers are going to they're going to band together and form something called the Farmers Alliances. And they're also going to create a new political party called the Populist Party. It's also nicknamed the People's Party. Again, it's a new political party like Democrat, Republican. And they wanted things like a government-owned railroad, government-owned telephone and telegraph systems. They wanted an 8-hour workday and limits on immigration. These are all things that they supported. Unfortunately, they didn't get a candidate elected to president, but oh well, they still had a big say in politics. So here's a picture of the National Grange. So it's showing like farmers, getting help and learning how to do things. That was a great description. And here's the election of 1896. You're going to see President McKinley. He's the one who becomes president, sorry. McKinley runs against Bryan, the Democratic candidate, and McKinley is going to win, notice his electoral college vote, and then he also gets the popular vote as well. Just barely, actually, but he gets it. And that's where we end these notes. So again, we talked about people moving west. We talked about, some good things like railroads. We also talked about some not great things like Native American conflict, lots of them being killed, taking land. Things aren't going to be fixed for a long time. And we talk about farming and things like that. So hopefully you enjoyed this notes presentation and it was helpful for you. And remember, you can always go back to anything that you missed. And don't forget to check out that video if you haven't yet. I really like it. It's a clip from this movie called Far and Away. And it's about, it has like Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, if you know who those people are. And they're both like Irish immigrants who were here to like get free land because life back in Ireland was really tough. So check out that clip. I put it in your notes.